So for those of you I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Mark Agnew. I'm the Senior Director of International Policy at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. It's a pleasure to have our colleagues from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, to talk about some of the economic security and foreign interference threats that are facing Canadian businesses at the moment. As someone who's been working on international issues for as long as I have, this has always been a timely topic given the state and non-state threats that have faced companies. But I think certainly in the COVID context, it's taken on a whole new level of importance. And for those of you who will have seen the news this morning about the Russian government involved in hacking related to vaccinations, this is sort of just, I think, another example of why this is a good topic to have CSIS come and speak with us about, and thank them also for their proactive outreach. So with that, I'll stop there, and I guess, Renee, it's over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning, everybody. My name is Renee Willett. I'm the Director General of Academic Outreach and Stakeholder Engagement with CSIS. Nous sommes très heureux d'être invités aujourd'hui à vous parler. We've been working very closely with our counterparts at the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity and the Communication Security Establishment over the last little while to protect Canadians and Canadian interests against threats to our national security and prosperity. Since about mid-May, we've been deploying our intelligence officers and liaison officers from regional offices across the country to meet with individuals and organizations involved in the Canadian effort to respond to COVID-19. These outreach efforts have included engagement with industry reps in biopharma and health sciences, and more broadly, high-tech and manufacturing, as well as industry association supply chain contacts like port authorities and those in academia and other governments, other levels of government. CSIS, by way of background, investigates threats to security Canada, and for the purpose of this discussion, we'll just be discussing mostly foreign interference and espionage emanating from hostile state actors and their proxies. Our role is largely to advise the Government of Canada of these threats so it can take action where appropriate, and in some cases to counter those threats directly ourselves. So we're grateful for the opportunity that you provided to share some of our concerns related to foreign interference and espionage. Threats that could have a very real impact on your businesses and Canada's economic prosperity and innovation. The focus of the Canadian Business Resilience Network on preparation, perseverance, and prosperity is very much aligned with the objectives and the message that we've been passing along through this outreach initiative. We are working pretty hard to get people the information that they need to take proactive steps to protect themselves, their research, and their investments. The threats are not new, as you know, but the current pandemic and the context provided by that has seen a surge in innovation across the country, increasing reliance on remote work arrangements, and a lot more international partnerships. And so these have provided opportunities for hostile actors to exploit at our expense. I'll just point out recently Australia's defense minister gave a speech discussing some of these same issues, and she kind of referred to it this way. She mentions that nations are increasingly employing coercive tactics that fall below the threshold of armed conflict. Cyber attacks, foreign interference, and economic pressure seek to exploit the gray area between peace and war. And in this gray zone, she said, when screws are tightened, influence becomes interference, economic cooperation becomes coercion, and investment becomes entrapment. As our director also noted in our most recent annual report, we believe the threats of espionage and foreign interference represent the greatest danger to Canada's national security, and they can have a tremendous impact on our economic growth, our ability to innovate, our sovereignty, and our national interests writ large. So this is why we created a new stakeholder engagement team in November of last year. We've been engaging now with a variety of stakeholders in private and research sectors, including in the pandemic context, but also looking to the future with regard to broader priorities related to Canadian prosperity, competitiveness, and innovation. So your feedback and your input is extremely important to us. This is a bit of a new area for us. We're kind of pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone of talking mostly to our government partners with top secret clearances, but we do look forward to the feedback you have, and it'll help us refine kind of the outreach that we will continue doing with the private sector and some of across the country. So we know that your businesses are facing complex and unprecedented challenges in this era of virtual learning, virtual work, funding constraints, and in parallel, obviously, with this changed threat landscape. Current economic conditions make some of you probably more vulnerable to hostile or covert attempts to gain access and control through foreign ownership and investment in your companies. Staff in our regional offices have reported that a number of companies have asked for support in vetting possible investors and partners in these times. We'd invite you to reach out to us directly if you have any specific questions on that following today's briefing. So our objective today is in conducting this outreach is not to hamper trade, innovation, or investment. Quite the opposite. We want to ensure that the interests of Canada's business and research community, its human talent, R&D, intellectual property, and other assets and investments are protected against hostile actors seeking to exploit our open business environment in pursuit of their own geopolitical ambitions. And with those opening remarks, I'm happy to pass things over to our senior intelligence analyst to brief you further on these threats and the trends that we've been seeing, and to help you provide advice on how to protect your information and your business interests. Étant donné la composition de cette audience, nous allons reprendre la majorité de cette présentation en anglais, mais nous sommes certainement prêts à clarifier nos commentaires et de répondre vos questions en français aussi. Et c'est tout. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Renee. It's Alex here. I'm a senior intelligence analyst in CSIS's Espionage and Economic Security Unit, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to talk to us today. It's a great opportunity. So what is economic security? From a CSIS perspective, we investigate three main types of economic security threats to Canada. The first, state-sponsored theft and transfer of Canadian technology and know-how from our private sector and academia. Two, the acquisition and exploitation of sensitive Canadian data, often referred to as big data, including financial and health information. And three, foreign access and control over Canada's critical infrastructure, everything from our electrical grid to our telecommunications sector and future 5G networks. So some really important issues for our country and important issues for your business. My personal goal today is to raise your awareness of economic security threats. We'll not prevent state-sponsored espionage campaigns in one discussion, but we can raise awareness and help you become risk savvy. I know that it's unconventional for a spy agency to discuss national security issues beyond our traditional government clients and at an unclassified level. This is challenging, but it's necessary. The world of espionage has evolved beyond covert agents breaking into government safes to steal state secrets. Spies now wear lab coats, not trench coats. Your companies possess things of tremendous value to Canada and to other nations. You conduct research and development, you create valuable IP, and your technology and know-how are the current priority espionage targets of other nations. Finally, before we dive into economic security threats, I want you to know that you're not alone. After today, I hope that you will talk to your local CSIS representative about your security issues and concerns. So let me offer you a bottom line up front. Economic security threats are real, and your company may be targeted. There's three things I'd like to cover: what is happening, why it's happening, and how this is occurring and what you can do about it. So let's start with the what is happening. Almost all sectors of the Canadian economy face economic security threats. In certain sectors, this threat is significant in its scope, scale, and impact. This is not hypothetical. Every day, CSIS investigates how Canadian companies, like yours, have been targeted and compromised. Why is this happening? Canadian companies are often at the forefront of innovation and technology. We also enjoy many national advantages, such as world-class education, an advanced economy and robust financial sector, an independent legal system and protections for IP, and our commercial approach and economic openness to many emerging and developed markets based on our Western principles of free markets and fair competition. Some countries do not play by the same rules. Some countries do not reciprocate Canada's openness and support for a level playing field. Some nations are aggressively advancing their own economic, intelligence, and military state interests at our expense. Your company's work in IP is valuable, and as a result, you may be a target of hostile state activity. How is this occurring, and what can you do about it? This threat takes many forms. However, your company can take various measures to reduce your risk, create resilience, and protect yourself. The first step is being aware of these threats. So we've talked about the what, the why, and the how. I'm going to spend a bit of time now to actually unpack all of those elements before we go to the Q&A. So let's focus on the what. Canadian companies in almost all sectors of our economy have been targeted, compromised, and have suffered losses from economic security threats. CSIS has observed persistent and sophisticated state-sponsored threat activity for many years now. We investigate this daily from coast to coast. I have witnessed this state-sponsored espionage unfolding in all major Canadian cities. If I had to characterize the sectors at greatest risk, I would describe them as emerging technology, which is often at the cutting edge of innovation, dual use, as it offers both economic and potential military benefits, and revolutionary in its potential impact on our future prosperity and security outcomes. In particular, I would cite Canada's biopharm and health sector, artificial intelligence, quantum, ocean technology, and aerospace sectors as facing particularly severe threat activity. Emerging technologies in these sectors are also among the most vulnerable to state-sponsored espionage, as they're largely developed within academia and small startups, which may have less security awareness and protections, while also being motivated to pursue financial and collaboration opportunities, which can then be exploited by other countries. Regrettably, our investigations do reveal that this threat has caused significant harm to Canadian companies. Collectively, it jeopardizes Canada's knowledge-based economy. When our most innovative technology and know-how is lost, it is our country's future that is being stolen. I did not say this to raise undue concern that all Canadian companies face grave or imminent risk, but a prudential security posture is warranted. So let's talk a bit more about the why. Some countries do not respect our values or rules, and they act illicitly and aggressively in harmful ways. When other countries exert national-level efforts to acquire or steal IP that satisfies their economic security and military state interests, then it is no longer traditional private commerce. Your company's R&D and IP is globally valuable, and as a result, you may be an espionage target. Canadian companies thrive amid free markets and fair competition. Unfortunately, international business is not always a level playing field. Dependent on your business sector and activities, you may encounter state capitalism. That's when foreign state interests trump commercial interests. Commerce gets raised to the diplomatic level, and issues become linked and are continuously in motion. I don't have to remind you of the real world events that have shown this in action, but I will note that it's hard to compete and win when you engage with state capitalism, because then Canadian companies no longer enjoy stability and equality in their business dealings. Worse still is that some nations routinely resort to outright espionage in its most clandestine and corrosive forms. Those countries employ sophisticated and well-resourced intelligence services that will spy and steal to secure their own national advantage. It is no secret that we are most concerned about the actions of countries like China and Russia. But we should also not discount that threat activity evolves and can originate from anywhere in the world. Even beyond countries, non-state actors. Sorry, I'll let everyone go back on mute. Even beyond countries, non-state actors like organized crime groups may pose a threat to your company. So let's talk about the how. State-sponsored espionage and economic security threats may take many forms. On your screen, you're going to see a CSIS graphic that we call the 4 gates of economic security. It was developed based on a decade's worth of CSIS intelligence and analysis. It shows that sensitive and proprietary Canadian technology, know-how, and assets can be accessed in any one of 4 ways: attacks on knowledge, investments, imports and exports, and licenses. I'm going to offer some brief comments on each, and then we can go deeper in the Q&A if it's of interest. Knowledge. Canadian R&D, IP, as well as personal and corporate data can be compromised in many illicit ways, such as cyber espionage, insider threats within your company, and foreign intelligence operations. I will not spend much time discussing cyber espionage, other than to say that some nations are relentless in their cyber attacks against Canadian companies. And they're very good at circumventing our cybersecurity defenses to steal Canadian IP. I understand that our friends at the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity will be doing a separate briefing on that issue for you, and I encourage you to also attend that session. I do want to focus on a relatively new concern that CSIS refers to as non-traditional collectors. That simply means people without formal intelligence training or tradecraft. You may engage with these people through business partnerships, R&D collaboration, joint ventures, and financial discussions. In academia, that category includes visiting students and professors. In the commercial world, it includes scientists, researchers, business people, and investors. It starts to make sense if you think of it from the adversary's perspective. I could send a trained spy to compromise your company, but at what risk and for what reward? I cannot easily train them to become a microbiologist or an AI expert or even a realistic business person. They may not know what to steal, they will raise suspicions in their actions, and they risk being exposed. Instead, I can co-opt or coerce someone that you have invited in the front door, potentially for a long period of time, that offers plausible cover and persistent access. Better yet, that individual knows exactly what is most valuable in your company and may even gain direct access to it. Non-traditional collectors may not even have premeditated intent to cause harm. Instead, they're immensely vulnerable to the coercive demands of another country if they plan to return there, have family there, or financial interests. Other countries have powerful national security and intelligence laws that demand cooperation and create severe punishments for anyone who dared say no. Investment. Canada is an attractive destination for foreign investment, ranging from foreign acquisitions to venture capital. The vast majority of this investment is beneficial for Canada, but a small proportion is state-sponsored and harbors malign intent. Especially during this pandemic, CSIS has come to realize that foreign governments may pursue investment to gain access and control of Canadian technology and know-how, or even access or control over Canadian critical infrastructure and essential supply chains. For years now, CSIS has seen state-sponsored acquisitions aimed at Canada's most sensitive technology, data, and critical infrastructure assets. Please realize that what initially appears to be a lucrative foreign investment offer may have hidden strings and consequences attached. In that regard, we encourage you to have discussions with Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada as they manage Canada's foreign investment review mechanism, the Investment Canada Act. Imports and exports. Foreign acquisitions of advanced and dual-use technologies, which can then be copied or reverse engineered, is a well-known national security concern across Western countries. It's why we and our allies have export controls to prevent proliferation of military-relevant technologies. Reverse engineering allows foreign engineers and scientists to recreate the imported or stolen products of Canadian companies and thereby forego the time and cost of R&D. The practice of reverse engineering is consistent with some nations' industrial policy goals to introduce, digest, absorb, and re-innovate foreign technology. A new concern during this pandemic is a growing awareness of the risk of disruption of vital Canadian supply chains and imports. For example, the personal protective equipment and pharmaceuticals which underpin our sovereign public health capacity. If those supply chains are compromised and imports are unreliable or unavailable, it may affect Canada's health security and Canadian lives. And finally, licenses. Licenses and agreements may grant access to Canadian assets and data which may be exploited. In this category, we typically focus on visas to enter Canada, patents that protect IP, research and collaboration agreements with foreign partners, and the privileges granted to operate in our critical infrastructure, such as our telecommunications and banking sectors, which confer extraordinary access to the personal data and commercial information of millions of Canadians. The licenses are not the objective, but rather a means to the threat actor's ultimate goal, such as your IP or the data you hold. For example, if you enter into a licensing or contractual agreements with a foreign partner in the expectation that they will abide by that agreement and Canadian laws and norms, you may face some risks. Similarly, if you do business abroad, the rules in other countries will not be the same as Canada's and may actually be designed to tilt the favor towards their domestic firms. For example, forced sharing of Canadian technology with foreign partners can occur through joint ventures. One study of Canadian firms conducting joint ventures in China revealed that those arrangements were often not balanced or advantageous for the Canadian company. Instead of relatively equal equity portions, the Chinese partners routinely had majority control, as well as access to the Canadian company's technology. The research indicated that these foreign partners would almost certainly seek to ease the Canadian company out of the arrangement while keeping the Canadian IP. Let me share one anonymized example to clarify that. As part of a Canada-China cooperation strategy, a Canadian company was identified and sponsored by our government. They aimed to do technology demonstrations in China and created a joint venture with a Chinese partner to help with marketing and future sales. Unfortunately, their technology was quickly reverse engineered in China, and their anticipated China sales never materialized. Then, they faced new global competition as the Chinese produced and sold their product at lower cost, not having to account for all of the Canadian R&D that went into creating it. Although the Canadian company tried to diversify its business line, it ultimately went bankrupt. So let me wrap up. Economic security threats are real, and your company may be targeted. Threat actors may try all four gates, but they only need to succeed in one to significantly harm your company and Canada's national security. But you're not alone in facing these threats. The fact that we're having today's discussion shows that our government wants to work with you to protect your company and the invaluable work that you do in Canada. The collective benefit is that increased awareness helps us harden the target to deter and blunt the corrosive effects of espionage within Canada. We've covered a lot of material very quickly, and I do look forward to the Q&A. But I encourage you to reach out to your local CSIS representatives at any future point if we can be of assistance to investigate security issues or offer additional advice. You'll find our contact information on the placemat on your screen, as well as on the CSIS website. Thank you very much.
That's great. Well, thanks very much, Alex, for that presentation. There certainly was a lot to cover in that time, and I think it was a good way just to set the table for some of the discussion. Just to get right into it, then, we have a question here from Murray about some of the tools that CSIS and the other agencies offer. And the question was, do yourselves or the other agencies have any web tools to test infrastructure to help businesses, particularly those that are working with either police or government agencies in Canada?
So it's a good question. Unfortunately, I think already in this Q&A, we are going to run up into some hard limits of what we can say in a broad forum and at an unclassified level. We can't really discuss operational investigations or tools necessarily. I would say that there's certainly resources that we can bring to bear, which kind of goes to the main point that I finished with, where I actually encourage organizations to talk to their local CSIS representative, because everyone's situation is going to be different. I think those discussions are beneficial as we can understand the business that you work in, the risks that you might face, and actually work with you through those security issues, including potentially offering some tools along with our other government partners like the Cyber Center, to help you manage those risks.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here, because I know we have a number of folks on the line that are from the financial services industry, and I'm guessing sort of where this question is coming from, Alex, is you had identified a number of sectors that were at greatest risk. I don't think you said anything about fin services, so I was wondering if you could say anything about banking and the insurance and other financial service industries and what the sort of threat environment out there looks like for them.
A few comments. I think that it's important to recognize that the financial sector is part of Canada's designated critical infrastructure that emphasizes how important it is to our country and to many other sectors that rely on it in terms of reliable function, providing capital, safeguarding massive amounts of very sensitive information. Unfortunately, through our work, we have discovered that there is significant threat activity directed against our financial sector. But I would say, at least in terms of our major financial institutions, that they are very well aware of these risks and generally have very good security postures to manage those things, including cybersecurity as well as the human elements. So there's ongoing dialogue between CSIS and all of those financial institutions, which I think is very mutually beneficial.
Okay. There's a question specific to the energy sector. Are you able to say anything about the foreign interference effects as it pertains to that industry, both in kind of the current environment and any, I guess, historical anecdotes you might be able to offer?
In terms of the energy sector, again, I would flag that this is designated critical infrastructure, which underlines how important it is for a country, for our economy, for our way of life. We want the power to stay on. We need heat to continue in the winter. So one comment that I would make is that that kind of sector may seem like a very interesting target for another nation state that wanted to do reconnaissance, for example. The way that this is generally talked about in open sources is that this is sort of a low probability but high impact consequence if there was ever threat activity that disrupted the operations of our electrical grids, for example. So again, there's a lot of discussions that CSIS and other government partners have with that sector, often with Natural Resources Canada in those discussions, to try to understand and manage those evolving threats.
Okay. You had mentioned in your presentation about the increased sort of risks that come from the remote working environment that many of us find ourselves in, as you'll see from the screens around the webinar. There was a question here around platforms that are most susceptible to interference, and I was wondering if you'd be able to say a word about those in terms of the relative risks, whether it be using your internet services at home, using VPN connections, iPhones, tablets, and those sorts of devices.
So that's actually not our primary focus in CSIS, and I actually think that that topic will be well covered in the session that you guys will receive from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. Just from a general economic security perspective, though, I would note that it's a new world that we're in. We've all been forced to adapt, where businesses have had to move to things like remote work, a lot of virtual connections, and we've all seen the news about the security issues that that entails. I would just urge prudence and caution. If information and issues that you're dealing with are confidential, if they're commercially sensitive, if they're important for your company, if they involve your IP or the sensitive data that you hold, you should adopt a prudential security approach. But in terms of specific platforms and the specific risks of using those kind of services, I would have to defer to my cyber colleagues in that other session.
Okay.
I can jump in for a second as well. Just point out we wouldn't, as a government department or agency, we wouldn't recommend one business over another, for example. But we do have a bit of a matrix of a lot of these platforms that we can send to you that give a bit of background on their security postures as well. So we can forward that to you, Mark, after this, and you can share it with your membership if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic, Renee. Thank you. So maybe I'll just to sort of pick up on that question. I mean, if I'm a company, listening to you today, you've piqued my interest, and I want to learn more, information. I mean, I know we're not kind of customers in the traditional business sense of the word, but what is it that businesses would expect on their journey from engaging with you, and what might that kind of process look like to work with a private sector organization?
Sure, I'll give some comments and then maybe encourage Renee to sort of follow up from a stakeholder engagement perspective. I think every sector and every company is going to be unique. We do have regional offices across the country. So I guess one vision that I would have of this is that if you have general concerns, like after today, you want to learn more, you want to explore the risk that your company might face, or maybe you face a particular issue and concern at any future point, I would encourage you to talk to our regional office. That would probably include one of our investigators or liaison units going to talk to you to understand the unique circumstances that you're facing. And if it's a very specific issue or concern that you have, that could lead to an investigation where we're going to try to gather information, maybe bring tools to bear, and probably develop a relationship with you over time so that we can better understand the situation and help you manage it. But every case is going to be unique here. So that's a broad characterization that I'm offering.
No, that pretty much nails it. And part of the discussion that we would have with you as well, once we are in touch and get the specifics of concerns that you might have, would be providing you advice on what other government agencies or departments might be more in the wheelhouse of that sort of problem that you're having. We are well integrated with our national security partners across the country, across the government, I should say, and national security right now, at least from the Government of Canada's perspective, is considered a lot broader than just CSIS and the Cyber Centre. We are working more closely than ever with the Department of Industry, for example, as Alex mentioned earlier, National Research Council. These are all kind of departments and agencies that we have close relationships with that we can direct you toward as well if the concern that you have is not strictly in our sort of national security, specific national security realm, but also but more in the broader concerns that they would
have. Okay. And maybe just on a very functional level for you guys, if I'm a small business particularly and I don't have that pre-existing relationship, are all the contact coordinates for your regional offices on the CSIS website?
Yeah.
Yes, and even on the placemat that you see in front of you, there's contact information there: phone, email, website. It's all available.
Okay. So, I mean, there's a question here, Alex, unsurprisingly, about Huawei. So, you know, I mean, I understand there's going to be limitations to what you're able to say, but just, I mean, any kind of broad observations you can make about that situation, and perhaps, you know, situated in the context perhaps of what's going on in the U.S.-China geopolitical dynamic as well?
It's really not any specific comments that I can safely make at an unclassified level in front of a broad audience, other than to acknowledge that these issues are playing out in real time. You will have all seen the news about the UK's decision in terms of how they wanted to handle their national security. You will have seen news about Canada's consideration about Huawei and our future 5G networks. I could reassure you that CSIS has been a part of those discussions for quite some time now, providing very clear, consistent security advice. But I can't comment about Canada's pending decision. That would be something for public safety to comment on. And then on your point about US-China, yes, it's an interesting world in terms of geopolitics, technology, trade, bilateral and multilateral relations. But basically, as far as I can go today on an unclassified call, is to acknowledge all of these forces and tell you that it's certainly shaping our work from an economic security perspective, and it has a nexus to what you do as companies as well.
Yeah, and I think certainly, you know, I could very easily say hand on heart that the U.S.-China dynamic does fully shape what, you know, we do as the Chamber day in, day out on international issues, and what our, you know, members are seeing out there. So again, this might be a question a bit more for the Cybersecurity Center briefing, but is there anything that you can say on, I mean, I suppose people don't really know if their emails are being, you know, collected by virtue of, you know, no one's going to come out and say I'm spying on your emails, but are there any, you know, tips or anything that you can offer from the CSIS perspective on people's email usages particularly, and ensuring the protection of information that is transmitted via that medium?
So I'd agree with your first statement. Like, this is really the expertise of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity and our CSC colleagues. Maybe just a simple observation that I personally find a lot of these things fairly complex. I use email, but I don't actually know where my emails go in terms of transiting servers around the world, how those things are stored, how they may be accessed. So the way that I approach this in my personal life is I don't put anything into an email that I couldn't tolerate other people reading. And I would assume from a business perspective that you would not put highly confidential, commercially sensitive, information, including intellectual property or sensitive data. I wouldn't put that in an email. That's just my own personal view on it.
Okay. So we got a question in about social media platforms, and actually this is what I'm personally quite interested in, given the Chamber spends a lot of time talking about our work on social media platforms of LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. We've seen the discussion about the troll farms and impact on elections and democratic process. So I'd just be curious, could you say anything about what you're seeing in terms of the kind of soft cyber influence or more direct cyber influence vis-a-vis social media platforms and how that's affecting Canadians?
So good question. It's not an issue that's a central focus for the Economic Security Unit, and maybe that's something that Renee, I'm just thinking off the cuff here, that we could take back to maybe offer a future session where we do have experts that deal with those kind of things in terms of foreign influence, how that plays out in our democracy, how that impacts our sovereignty. I guess I would just offer again my personal view on the issue. Be critical about what you read. We can all look at these issues playing out, being sort of investigated by universities, by researchers that show that there is malign foreign influence that exploits social media platforms, because that's useful for other countries to try to shape our public discourse, to shape public opinions, to try to influence our decision making. So that is very real as a topic. I know that we have experts that focus on that, so maybe that's something that we could explore in the future to have a session devoted to that kind of topic.
Yeah, and I think certainly that would be one of interest to us as an organization, because a lot of our work in representing members is using social media, platforms, and absolutely disinformation that is being propagated on various platforms, makes our job more difficult when we're representing the interests of Canadian businesses. There's an interesting question here around, I guess maybe I could say it's the types of state actors that are out there posing a risk to Canada. I think we talk a lot about countries like Russia and China. But I mean, are there other, the way the questions here is talking about countries that share our values, but maybe if I put it more broadly, are there other, democratic, industrialized countries out there where there are still state actor or state-backed actor risks facing Canadian companies from an economic espionage standpoint?
From a CSIS perspective, we are most focused on authoritarian countries who are using whole of society efforts, very powerful intelligence services, state-owned enterprises, coercing, co-opting their private sector companies and individuals to achieve their state objectives. But I guess the broader point I would make goes back to my earlier comments and the remarks that I gave you. Yeah, we're most worried about China and Russia. There are a number of tier 2 nation states that are conducting threat activity, maybe more limited in its scope or scale or impact. But threats can come from anywhere. They can even come from non-state actors like organized crime groups. I think that you need to exercise sort of an all hazards approach if you want to protect your company, if you want to remain in business, if you want to keep your intellectual property. I don't really think that the identity of your robber, your thief, is the most important question. I think that you should be aware that threats can come from anywhere, from many countries, from many non-state actors as well.
So just picking up on that point, there's a question here around job applicants, and is there any advice or tools available to companies to help them screen applicants that may be applying for a job as a way to, I don't think you can fully eliminate, but at least reduce risks of state-sponsored activities behind those job applicants?
Sure, it's a good question. And I think that that's actually always been an issue for companies, just to know, who are you hiring? What is their background? Or is there any risk in hiring these kind of applicants? And I think that's something that has generally worked for companies for a long time, is due diligence, having good policies and practices in place to do thorough vetting. There is no magical tool to identify the bad actors, be it in job applicants, for universities trying to identify students that might be problematic, to identify foreign investors that might be problematic, to identify foreign partners like in a licensing agreement. There is no one tool to do this. It is all a matter of process and due diligence and trying to be thorough in your vetting and understanding who are you getting into business with, be it a business partner or be it someone that you're going to hire as an employee who might have access to your company's IP and sensitive data.
So building on that, there's another question that's come in about insider threats, and what you talked about, addresses that maybe at the, if I can call it the front end or the upstream part of it, when people are trying to work for a company in the first instance. But is there anything you can share around known tactics to help detect insider threats, perhaps from people that are already employees of the company?
Sure, and I'll encourage Renee to jump in after this, because I think there might be some open source guides or tools that we can bring to bear here, maybe share afterwards. And I'll also loop back to the beginning in terms of talking to your local CSIS representative, if there was especially any particular situation or concern that you had. But I guess the broad comment that I'll offer to you is unusual behavior. There's a number of indicators that are out there in the open realm or that CSIS would use, which may correlate to potential insider threat activity. But if things are unusual, if things just don't seem to make sense in terms of an employee's behavioral patterns, staying at work really, really late, unusual curiosity in other people's work that totally does not relate to their business activities, maybe it's financial indicators, like they're going through a period of financial distress, marital distress, like many things can provide sort of a warning signal. And those are probably good discussions for you to have as a company with your local CSIS representative, where we can actually show you some of those indicators and work through it in your particular context.
Yeah, we developed some guidance that we shared with the university, or that we worked with the Universities Canada on to assist researchers in identifying these sorts of issues. Another thing I think you might want to pay attention to in talking to your employees, as Alex mentioned earlier, sort of autocratic countries that are able to exert pressure on their citizens. If there are employees of yours who have families in some of those countries, those are also that's also sort of exposes them to certain pressures that they might not otherwise to take measures, I guess, that they would not otherwise want to do. So there's a lot of, in this area, sort of unwitting threats, I guess, in the sense that you want to make sure that your employees feel comfortable speaking with you, I guess, about their personal situations and some of the risks that they may feel they are at in terms of their potential home countries and their families there. But we'll share some of that information with you in writing afterwards as well, that you can circulate to your folks.
That'd be great. Thank you. And there's a couple of these questions about insider threats, and I'll just pick up on another one here, and that's around the balance of the risk. So, obviously, if I'd gone back to my grandparents' generation, cybercrime wasn't that big of a threat, but now, for folks working in 2020, it is. What does the balance of the threat sort of environment look like in terms of the shift between insider threats versus cybercrime? What is there anything you can say about the trends between the two?
Good question. I'd actually maybe start off by pointing to the graphic on the screen. We created the 4 gates for a reason, in terms of understanding that this is a broad range of threat activity, and every case is going to be different. Sophisticated threat actors, like other nation states, are going to try to explore how to achieve their objectives. They're going to look at your company. They're going to try to understand whether there are particular vulnerabilities. They're going to try all of these gates, and any one of them being open allows them to win. And it's not even in silos too. There's actually connections between this type of tradecraft. Like maybe cyber is the first tool, and then it becomes like a human-based threat. Or maybe it's human-enabled cyber activity directed at your company. So you really do need to have an all hazards kind of approach to managing this in terms of, is it mostly cyber? Is it mostly human? It's everything. And maybe it's a bit different for each sector, but that threat picture continues to evolve, and it's very customized for any individual company, which is viewed as a target by another country.
Okay. So, I mean, if we could take a number of the points you said, and then, even if it was like an anonymized, example, or, any case studies you can draw upon, there's a question here about, what steps companies should take when they're initiating foreign contacts, such as investors, business partners, and suppliers. I mean, you talked about this in various parts in some of your answers already, but, let's say I'm again, a small Canadian business. I'm looking at country X for the first time, don't really have many contacts pre-existing there. What are some of those real practical type things that you could recommend to help me as I'm starting out?
Maybe I'll give you an analogy that just comes to mind. It's like a marriage. I'm not going to get married to someone that I've just met. I think it's a process of developing trust. It's a process of getting to know your potential business partner, of building that relationship over time. The amount, the depth of connections that you have, how much you're sharing. I think that you do need to take your time. I think you need to do your due diligence to understand who you're going to be doing business with, even from a reputational perspective. So I think that these things are gradual. They take time. You need to know who you'll be marrying.
Well, I was in a long distance relationship for a little while, so certainly had lots of time to think and reflect on that one. But that's a separate story altogether. So there's a question here about China specifically, and I mean, I don't want to get into travel advice because I know that's Global Affairs Canada's remit, but given obviously a lot of our members do business in China, is there any advice that you can provide specifically about advice for Canadian companies as they're starting out or continuing to do business in the Chinese market?
We recently updated our Far From Home document. Initially, it was intended for Government of Canada officials traveling abroad, but we've expanded it now to make it more applicable to businesses as well. So I believe it's on our website, but I'll make sure that you get a copy or a link to it as well after this, and you can share it broadly. It provides a number of tips in a fairly candid format that includes a lot of tradecraft discussions about what you should be looking out for during international travel and to protect your assets while you're there. We'll share that with you afterwards.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question here around influencing public policy debates, and this touches a little bit on some of the social media question. We talked about some of this a bit early on, but in terms of influencing the public policy process specifically, is there anything that you can share from that perspective? I know obviously there had been stuff in the news a couple of years ago about politicians, so I don't want to sort of pick on one particular part of the public policy process, but is there anything you can say about public policy development writ large and the role of foreign interference in the Canadian environment?
I think this goes back to one of the earlier comments I gave at the outset of the Q&A, where we're running into a pretty hard limit on what we can say at an unclassified level in a broad forum. These get into very sensitive discussions, but one thing that maybe I could suggest is that this is a theme, foreign influence in terms of policy and politics, that maybe could be woven into any future discussions that we have about like social media. Like there are experts within CSIS that are devoted to these kind of issues, and they may be able to talk about some of this at an unclassified level in the future.
Okay. And again, as an economic policy, organization, I think that's definitely a conversation that we would find, quite useful to have. There's a question here about sort of internal to Canada risks, and we spent a lot of talking about foreign interference, but I was wondering if you could just say anything about the domestic environment, and any advice you have to companies about protecting themselves from other entities in Canada that may have nefarious intents or purposes.
I guess a couple of quick comments there. Given our mandate as a security intelligence service, we are focused on sort of those foreign entities, that state-sponsored espionage, those kind of economic security threats. But I do acknowledge that there is espionage between companies, commercial espionage, competitors who would rip you off. That is true. I'm sure that has existed for some long time and will continue to do so. That is then effectively within Canada a policing matter. So one partner that we work with, like Renee said, working as an entire government on these issues cohesively is the RCMP. I know that they have a similar unit to CSIS that deals with those kind of issues. So I would recommend in those kind of circumstances that you talk to the RCMP or your local police force, because it's a criminal matter at that point.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really helpful to have. There's one last question here. It's a bit more of a technical one in nature, but I gather there is a rule in the United States around IP controls and relatives who live in overseas sort of hostile states. I'm guessing this has perhaps something to do with security clearances, which you might not be able to advise on. But is there any rules that you're aware of around that area?
Sure. I'm actually not familiar. I'm maybe not connecting the question to a specific policy. I'm also not fully up to speed on all of U.S. policies, for example. So that will be a tough one for me to answer. Renee, do you have anything on that?
Can you specify you're referring to sort of security clearances provided to individuals in the private sector to allow them to receive government information?
So the question reads, the U.S. requires IP control for employees who have overseas relatives in hostile states, bracket, something like 3 generations removed, close bracket. Do we have a similar rule in Canada?
No, not that I'm aware of. I don't think so. Okay.
Well, that brings us pretty much to the top of the hour, and I think we got through pretty much every question that had been asked. So, Renee, why don't I turn it over to you or Alex if you want to say a final word, and then we can wrap it up.
Sure thing. Alex, do you have anything you want to add before I wrap up? Or
no, just to reiterate the thanks. I really do appreciate all of the businesses taking time to talk to us today.
I'll just thank you, repeat that, and thank you, everybody. As I mentioned earlier in their open discussion as well, this is sort of a new area for us. A lot of our, as Alex has been mentioning a couple times over the course of the discussion, our regional offices across the country, do have contacts in the private sector. They do go out and speak with companies. But it's the first time since November. This is sort of the first time we've had sort of national level coordination and oversight of those sorts of discussions that are happening, and we're really trying to push ourselves to have a much more of a public face with our private sector partners in some of the critical infrastructure areas, obviously, but also in other areas that we see are increasingly attracting the interest of foreign states and foreign actors. So we really would appreciate any feedback you might have. You can obviously get it to us through Mark or contact our regional offices, as Alex has been mentioning, because this is something that we will be looking to do more of in the future, and try to do it in a way that's more that meets your needs. And part of that is sort of having these kinds of discussions to get to know you better, get to know your interests better, get to know your companies better, and hopefully have you get to know us a little bit better as well. So thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated.
Well, and Renee, Jacqueline, and Alex, let me just say thank you very much for the proactive outreach to us. It's one of those ideas I wish I had thought of first. So your time is much appreciated. And although you weren't able to answer everything today for obvious reasons, at least what you were able to share was quite useful. And I think as a part of the government that the Chamber, frankly, hasn't really engaged much with in the past, it's good to be able to make this first contact. And we'll certainly send the follow-up material once we get it from you to our members. And just say thank you again to everyone for making the time, and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.